He was a maestro on the Lagos concert scene, but then he turned his back on it all, and in the process created revolutionary music that has influenced every generation since. The sound is distinct and powerful. The passion in the 40-plus recordings of songs with piano accompaniment is palpable. This is Josiah Jesse Ransome-Kuti singing the melodies that will define his legacy. Of course, the constraints of the recording arrangement meant the recordings did not adequately capture what his music would have sounded like at home. It was missing the accompaniment of native instruments and backing vocalists, and the energy, spontaneity, and flair that characterized his performances. The songs were recorded over a period of 3 weeks in June 1922 at the Gramophone Company's studio in Hayes, Middlesex. Ransome-Kuti was then in England attending a missionary exhibition organized by the CMS. As far as we can tell, getting the songs recorded was purely on his own initiative. The songs were released on the Zonophone record label that year. According to the liner note, he made these records, quote, so that the sacred songs of his own composition and other records of interest may be available to all Yoruba-speaking people, end quote. There is an innocence, a freshness, even eeriness to the recordings. His sound is haunting, grave, and gripping. There was a somberness baked into Ransome-Kuti's soul and thus his music, a tinge of melancholy pulsating with divine energy. Through these songs, we're taken back in time to the period that marked the transition from an exclusively European form of church music to the use of compositions and melodies inspired by the musician's cultural roots. By the 1890s, a few voices had begun to express concern that the prevailing form of church music primarily catered to European ideas of what was acceptable as sacred music. They argued that this prevented new Christians who did not belong to the imagined educated class from having a meaningful and vital participation in church worship. Also, considering that music could be a powerful tool in the preaching of the gospel, they contended that the prevailing form limited the church's ability to win converts. A number of people made attempts to rectify this situation. One of them was James White, a Yoruba evangelist and the first person to preach a public sermon in Lagos. Another was Ademuyiwa Hastrop, a wealthy Ijebu prince and Methodist lay preacher who played a major role in opening up Ijebu land to Christian missions. Mojola Agbebi, a leading Baptist preacher in Lagos, promoted the use of native compositions and musical instruments. But Ransome-Kuti was by far the boldest innovator of the era. In song after song, he's maneuvering the contours of a people's soul, finding the slightest point of entry to break down their resistance to the message of the gospel. Sometimes he's pleading, sometimes he's taunting. In Keferewa Wobawao, he challenges idol worshippers using the structure of the traditional taunt song. In Oba Abake Awoke, he's making an emotional appeal. In Jesu Olugbala ni Mo Forí Fún, his goal is to undermine faith in the principal figures of traditional Yoruba religion. Ransome-Kuti's desire for his own people and the Yoruba nation at large to embrace the message of Jesus Christ was the driving force of his career. By the time he went into the studio in 1922, he had probably used many of these songs in his open-air meetings for about 2 decades, and it is clear that they were forged in the fires of evangelistic encounters. Biographer Isaac Delano has left us a powerful sketch of the force of Ransome-Kuti's music in his open-air meetings. Quote, mounted on a petrol drum, Kuti would be singing with hand raised, his earnest face illumined by the peace in his soul, his bushy hair waving in the breeze. The people around him would sing lustily. They sang as they felt as they sang. The same cure, the same key was offered for the unlocking of the mysteries of their hearts. End quote. In all his stations, the marketplace was the battlefield, and music was the vehicle through which he launched his attack on the gates of hell. He would usually sing tunes that he knew the local people loved, with Christian words set to the music. Sometimes, the words were set to tunes he had learned in fetish groves as a child. His music was written and performed based on a profound comprehension and appreciation of the language, symbols, history, and customs of the people. His willingness to utilize these elements in the audacious way that he did was revolutionary in his day. In a way, his whole life had been a preparation for this role. Ransome-Kuti was born in 1855 in Abeokuta to parents who were complete opposites in their religious faith. His mother, Anne Efukweyin, was a fervent Christian and one of the earliest converts to Christianity in Abeokuta. On the other hand, his father, Kuti, had a deep hatred for the Christian faith and went to his grave still holding out hope that Christianity would be stamped out of his native land. Predictably, theirs was a difficult marriage. Ransome-Kuti's early years were therefore a continuous pull in two different directions, which he described in these striking words. Quote, "I could claim to have eaten the idol meat and the missionaries' biscuits on the same day." End quote. Efukweyin once ran away from home with Josiah after threats to the boy's life by some relatives because of her refusal to renounce Christianity. For many years, Kuti opposed Efukweyin's desire to have the boy baptized, but her persistence eventually won through. Nevertheless, he was usually upset when people called his son Josiah. He personally called him Osho or Likoye and loved to shave his head, leaving a tuft of hair in the center, a form of counter-baptism. Efukweyin's hopes that her son would firmly commit to the Christian faith were realized after her husband's death. Josiah was 8 years old when he died. He would recall decades later how, as a child, his mother's heartfelt prayers continuously rang in his ears. Though Kuti lost his son to the missionaries, there was one part of him that continued to live on in Josiah and would become central to his life's work, a natural talent for music. Kuti was a renowned musician in the Gbeyi quarters of Abeokuta, and his son began his journey into music when, as a child, his father regularly took him to participate in festivities at fetish groves. Kuti was introducing Josiah to the mysteries of music in the worship of Yoruba deities. According to Delano, quote, "It was during that period that Josiah learned native music and tunes and the language of native drums." End quote. In the late 1860s, Ransome-Kuti was admitted to the CMS Training Institute at Abeokuta. The school had by then acquired a reputation for its musical training. This was due to the efforts of German missionary Gottlieb Bühler, who tutored the first crop of classically trained musicians in Yoruba land. Unsurprisingly, Ransome-Kuti excelled in music while at the school. He attended the CMS Training Institute in Lagos in the early 1870s. Upon graduation, he taught for a period at a school in Abeokuta, and in 1880, he was transferred to the CMS Female Institution in Lagos to teach music. The head of the school, Mrs. Adolphus Mann, admired his musical abilities and urged him to submit his ambitions to God's guidance. Ransome-Kuti would later note that her counsel made a major impression on him. Beyond the female institution, his musicianship made him famous in the city. With his prowess on the piano and harmonium and a fine singing voice, he regularly performed in concerts in Lagos in the 1880s and also at events hosted at the homes of the cream of Lagos society. At some point, his passion for making music became all-consuming, so much so that his superiors felt their hopes of him becoming an Anglican minister would be unrealized. His passion for performing at concerts and social events would surely preclude him from becoming a respectable parish pastor. Even his would-be father-in-law, the legendary Daniel Olubi of the Ibadan CMS Mission, hesitated in giving consent to him marrying his daughter for this reason. But they could not have been more mistaken. Later, As a pastor and evangelist, music was one of his major tools in opening new territories for the gospel. In the 16 years, he founded 25 churches in Egbaland, a major feat at the time. His time on the Lagos music scene came to an end in 1887 when he was sent to start a church at Gbagora in Abeokuta. His name was mentioned in the review of a concert in Abeokuta in 1888, but after this, his name seems to have disappeared from public journals. It reappeared in 1894 with a change. He had been known as Josiah Jesse Ransom, J.J. Ransom, from the time his name first appeared in print until 1888. It is unclear how he came about the surname Ransom. It was probably given by a missionary after his father's death. But when he reappeared in print in 1894, he was now known as J.J. Ransome-Kuti. He had added his father's name to his initial surname to form an Anglo-Yoruba last name. Also, by this time, his music had undergone a radical transformation. So, what happened during those years? We can make some guesses. First, like many others during this period, he was probably rethinking the prevailing assumptions about the connection between Christianity and European culture. Second, he must have been frustrated by the inadequacy of the prevailing form of church music to make an impression on those who are far removed from the Victorian world of the Lagos Christian elite. Perhaps other preachers could be content to make do with what existed, but not Ransome-Kuti, who was known to possess a strong personality. One story illustrates well this major change in outlook. Ransome-Kuti was hosted by some friends during a visit to Lagos in 1896, and they wanted to hear him sing and play the piano again. He initially resisted their urging, but eventually yielded, and they cheered. But their excitement quickly evaporated when Ransome-Kuti, rather than perform songs that Lagos concert goers were familiar with, began singing the Yoruba songs he had composed for his open-air meetings in Egbaland. His audience was disappointed. Essentially, he had had an awakening. Ransome-Kuti had now become disenchanted with what he saw as the snobbish, overly Europeanized outlook of the educated class. The church's overly sophisticated outlook was preventing its message from reaching the majority of people. During this period, many European missionaries denounced traditional customs, including native musical forms, as heathenish or at least crude, and frowned on converts expressing sympathy with their cultural roots. But Ransome-Kuti was determined to follow his own way. This was radical in his day, but so was Ransome-Kuti. While he remained within the most Anglo-centric denomination of his day, he rejected its bias against aspects of Yoruba life that were opposed simply because of European sensibilities, rather than any inherent paganism. Like a number of his contemporaries, he believed this bias prevented many Yorubas from embracing Christianity. This stance ensured that Ransome-Kuti's career as an Anglican minister would be turbulent, as some of his actions were considered non-conformist. In fact, he was censured by the church authorities at least twice, which resulted in a furore within the denomination. While the authorities dragged him before panels, everyday people praised him as their hero. One can infer from extant records that he was not particularly popular with the church hierarchy, but his stature made him a formidable figure. One major way Ransome-Kuti showed his independent thinking was through music. He boldly utilized elements of Yoruba culture such as chants, folk tunes and songs, poetry, idioms, and native instruments in a way no one had ever done. Even though some of his adaptations could have been considered controversial, his mission was unmissable. His goal was to push the message of the Christian gospel deep into the consciousness of the Yoruba nation. He was a man of deep spiritual devotion, and his music clearly bears this imprint. Many of the songs were groundbreaking in how deeply they tapped into the Yoruba cultural vein. The song, Oyigi Igi Lolorun Wa, was an adaptation of the melody and words used in ancient times by Ifa worshippers. The main line of the original version, Oyigi Igi Otaomio, which means the sea pebble is immortal, was a reference to the enduring nature of sea pebbles as conceptualized in Yoruba mythology. Ransome-Kuti's adaptation, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa o, Oyigi Igi Oba Eku, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa, captured God's majestic and immortal nature using the idiom and imagery with which the Yoruba could readily connect.
Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa o, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa o, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa, Oyigi Igi Oba Eku, Oyigi Igi Lolorun wa. Tolorun Lawa Ose exploited the ancient communal religious framework of Yoruba society. The greatest tool against conversion to Christianity in its early days in Yoruba land was the communal spirit, which trumped individual preference in the matter of religious worship and was ruthlessly employed against converts to Christianity. Ransome-Kuti was now appealing to that communal spirit, asking the Yoruba as a people to choose Jesus, opening the way for a flood of individual conversion. Ransome-Kuti's audacious spirit helped him push the boundaries of what was acceptable as church music in his day, giving the succeeding generation of Christian musicians the freedom to confidently create music utilizing cultural elements.